peak year, we were at about 517,000 deer hunters, and now we're about 480.
What is all that data telling you?
What does the future of deer management look like if hunter declines continue?
Will that be replaced at some point? Or are we seeing that in the trends, or is it looking like it's just going to continue to go down?
Well, interestingly,
Welcome back to the Ozark podcast. I'm your host, Kyle Veet, and I am joined, as always, by my good buddy, Kyle Plunkett.
Yes, sir.
How's it going, man?
It's good. Anytime we're in Springfield, Missouri is a good day.
It is a good day. It's nice to get up to the what do they call Springfield? The Queen City of the Ozarks.
That's what they say.
That's what they say. So we're here, and it's because we're joined by a very special guest, and that is Jason Isabelle, not Jason Isbell, the singer. This is Jason Isabelle of Missouri Department of Conservation. He's the state deer program coordinator, and he's been generous enough with his time in the middle of deer season to come hang out with us and talk to us. And we're going to ask him all kinds of questions about the overall health of deer population in the Ozarks, the Missouri Ozarks, the history of deer up here, and then also kind of how the history and what's going on currently plays into the future and the management plan that they're coming up with. Jason, first, welcome to the podcast. Thanks for coming on. And also, I know you guys are working on a 10-year plan that's coming out very soon. When does that come out? When can people expect to kind of see some of the new things that you guys are working on as far as management goes?
Sure, yes. We started the revision of our 10-year deer plan about a year ago, and we're just putting the finishing touches on it now. So our goal is to get the plan done later this month here in October, and so folks will be able to see it shortly after there.
Okay, awesome. Well, we're gonna jump into that. We'll save that for the end. Real quick before we get going any further, just tell us a little bit about yourself. How did you get to be the deer program coordinator? Kind of what's your background of even like where you grew up? Are you from Missouri? Did you grow up in the Ozarks? Give us a little bit of your history.
Sure, yeah. So I'm not a native Missourian. Actually, I was born and raised in Vermont, and my father was a game warden, and so that's kind of how I got my love for the outdoors and got an interest in working for a state fish and wildlife agency. So spent a lot of time as a youngster hiking, hunting, fishing, and just really enjoyed it. And from as early of an age as I can remember, I never wanted to do anything else other than to be a wildlife biologist.
Yeah.
And so earned my undergraduate degree in wildlife management in New York State. Then I spent about 4 years traveling around the country, and even spent a few months in Central America doing wildlife research, trying to build my resume. Worked on everything from whitetails to turkeys to coyotes, gray fox, and a variety of other wildlife species. And then I ended up in Texas for graduate school, and I studied wild turkey ecology for my master's degree in Eastern Texas. And then was fortunate enough, right out of grad school, a month after grad school, the position for Missouri's turkey program coordinator came open. And so I came up here and interviewed and was fortunate enough to get the job, and I've been here ever since. So the first 9 or so years I was with MDC was the turkey program coordinator. And then the position opened up to work with deer and elk, and so I decided to put my name in the hat and was fortunate enough to get this opportunity, and I've been doing it ever since.
Heck
That's
yeah.
cool.
That is cool. Did you ever picture yourself, working with deer? Is that something that you always wanted to do, or were you kind of always like, I think I'm going to stay on the turkey side of things?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I've always been passionate about both species. I've always had an interest in them. I've hunted both species since I was a young kid, and I studied turkeys for a master's degree, and so I had a lot invested in, just when you get immersed in a graduate program for 2 to 3 years, you kind of you dive real deep.
That's all you think about for a while.
It is.
Yeah.
And so I loved the turkey work. I really enjoyed it, but this was a unique opportunity to work with species that I'm equally passionate about. And, professionally, it was there are obviously a lot of similarities between, being the turkey program coordinator and deer, but there's some pretty stark differences too. And so I felt like I really enjoyed the turkey work, but I could make a significant contribution in the deer world with a species that I'm really passionate about. And professionally, it just felt like, the right decision for me to make, and I've really enjoyed it.
Yeah. And so how many years have you been doing it now?
Oh, we're closing in on 5 years.
Okay. All right. Well, we're going to dive into it. Last week, if you guys were listening, we talked with Ralph Meeker, who is the state deer program coordinator for Arkansas, and we talked about the Arkansas Ozarks. So we're going to dive into some of the Missouri Ozarks deer population stuff. To dive in, we always like to kind of go chronological. Talk to me a little bit about the history of the white-tailed deer in Missouri and the Missouri Ozarks, if you can, as far as just, the health, the population, the numbers, how things have changed over the last, 100, 200 years.
Yeah, so deer were abundant, throughout most of Missouri historically, probably more abundant in the northern part of the state than down in the Ozarks, but certainly had a healthy deer population. The story of whitetails in Missouri mirrors what a lot of other states went through in terms of, abundance and then depletion of the resource and then restoration and recovery. So, yeah, deer were abundant throughout the state, but that changed dramatically following European settlement, unregulated harvest. There was market hunting. The land ethic hadn't been developed yet, and folks, at that time, very utilitarian society had a mindset at that time that the resource was there to use and use to its fullest. And I think probably for a lot of folks, as they started down that trail, never realized how bad things could get. Mm-hmm. And so you had European settlement, you had market hunting, unregulated harvest. You also had at that same time massive clearings of forest. The woods were grazed, they were burned regularly. And so the quality of the landscape was being dramatically reduced and altered at the same time that the resource was being overexploited. And so, one number I always like to throw out there, especially for the younger generation that isn't aware or takes deer for granted, because now you drive down the road and you look out in the field and you see a deer.
They're everywhere.
It's not a big deal.
Yeah.
But you think about in the mid-1920s, we estimate there were 400 in the entire state.
400 total deer in all of Missouri.
And that's, to put that in perspective, right now we figure we're probably about 1.7 million. Man, so to think of a day where, you'll hear stories from talking to people that have lived long enough where, they'd walk out in the woods and see a deer track in the mud. Yeah. And then they'd go into town and tell everybody about it. Can you imagine, with where we are today, that seeing a deer track in the mud would be of any significance?
No.
So yeah, it was a very scary time where, they were almost gone. They were pretty darn close to zero.
To even think of like 400, and I don't know or even begin to know how many square miles the whole state of Missouri is, but that puts the density at just nothing, like a fractional percent to the millionth power, right? Like, I can't even imagine. Would that have been more centrally located in any one place in the state of, like, we think that population of 400 was maybe in the south or in the north or anything like that?
Yeah, mostly in the Ozarks. And it was really the same story with our turkeys, just because that terrain is so rugged and remote that it made it hard to shoot the last few.
Yeah, they could survive out there.
Yeah.
Yes.
They were, hunkering down in the hills and hollers.
Yeah, it was hard to get pretty close to zero, but that was really the last stronghold where there was enough remote areas where they never became extirpated.
Yeah, gotcha.
And so, yeah, you think about that time period and almost losing the whitetail, and then there was a shift, a really important shift that occurred then in society with more of the development of the conservation ethic and a shift from exploiting the resource to caring about it, wanting it to be out there, and realizing that at that time it was very clear that humans had a catastrophic effect on not just deer, but the landscape as a whole, wildlife. And so at that time was a really important time in the history of wildlife management. And it was a real big shift in public attitude towards wildlife that was really helped to be the springboard and the catalyst for the recovery of deer, turkeys, and a wide variety of species. So I would say that shift in the mindset was probably one of the more critical turning points to what it took to eventually, because if you think about the mindset of exploitation and this resource is here just for me to use and to use as much as I want, whenever I want to, we're having a dramatic impact. And if we'd like this to be around, we need to change the way we think about it.
Mhm.
We can still enjoy the resource, we can still use it in a consumptive way, but we've got to do it differently.
Yeah. What were in your mind? What were some of like in shifting that mindset? Were there some key initiatives or key focused efforts that led to that mindset shift?
I think probably, there was several different things, but I think a lot of it just has to do with how bad things got. You know,
Mhm.
I mean, if you think about where we were with the destruction of the landscape, deer and turkeys almost gone. I mean, if there's not something that's going to get you to change your ways, then I'm not sure what is,
Yeah.
right? So
Seeing
like
that number come out of like, there's only 400 deer left in the whole state, probably got some people like, oh man, we can't keep going like this.
yeah, and the hunting seasons were closed for a while, completely closed. But at that time, there wasn't any, conservation agents to enforce the regulations. So if you have regulations and there's nobody enforcing them, they probably didn't mean a whole lot at that time. So
Right.
we had, as our agency was formed, and as you had this changing mindset, this conservation ethic that was being instilled in the citizens, it really was the springboard for, okay, we recognize we're in a really bad situation. We want to improve that. Here's the plan for doing that. And at that time, the public was really anxious to be on board. And with that level of support, really started the recovery efforts for our whitetail population.
Gotcha.
That's even all correlating. I mean, that time period is Great Depression and Dust Bowl, and I mean, the urban sprawl is starting to happen, and there's a lot of things happening in the United States as a whole, right? In the 10s, 20s, 30s. So it makes sense that a state like Missouri and even Ozark or Arkansas from last week's episode, you look around and see what used to be an abundant landscape of wildlife and farmable land and good soil and all the stuff, and now it's depleted or it's getting depleted. And you're like, this was supposed to be my little slice of the American dream.
Mhm.
And it may not be here if we keep doing this. It makes sense that was the right time for really most of America to go. We're getting on board with whatever we decide is the right way forward to protecting our wildlife and our land. I haven't thought about all those things tying together yet, really, until right now.
Yeah, it's all within that time frame. So what were the biggest things from there that, like, at what point did you start seeing in Missouri the population really rebounding and getting to the point where it's like, all right, we've moved away from the baseline, which was 400. Now we're getting to a place where we're starting to see things really pick up.
Yeah, so as we got into the 30s, and into the 40s, started acquiring some, what we would have called refuges, some places that would be under state management that could serve as a place to increase deer numbers. We did translocate some deer from out of state to help supplement the population, and then those were translocated within the state too. So that was occurring a lot as we got into the 30s and into the 40s.
And those refuges would have been closed to hunting. They would have just been safe spaces to let the deer numbers kind of grow and breed, and then you can move those and translocate.
Yeah, and it happened pretty quickly. By the time we got into the early to mid 40s, estimate we had already about 15,000. So it increased, and it still obviously pales in comparison to what we have today, but it's a lot better than 400.
Oh, yeah.
And so got into the 40s, and that was a point in time where decided to start, even though the population was small and it was still growing, and there was obviously a desire for it to continue to grow, started our very first hunting season of modern times.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you think about the history of our hunting seasons from the very first one through where we are today, it's obviously changed dramatically from that first season being very, very restrictive and very, very small area of the state with buck-only harvest to, there was a period in time, not anymore, but there was a period in time where you could fill unlimited firearms antlerless permits in the majority of Missouri County.
No
so
way.
you think about that happened gradually through time, which makes sense. I mean, we had a small population. Let's be really conservative. But as we got into the 40s and after the 40s, deer have the ability for population growth at a pretty rapid rate.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was a point in time where I decided to have our first limited hunting opportunity. And as that's happening, that population is really starting to take off and really starting to grow. And then just, from a deer management standpoint, it was pretty easy at that point in time because our objective almost everywhere was we want to increase deer numbers. So from a harvest management standpoint, let's just have conservative seasons, have them be buck only, or then when we started having antlerless seasons, keep them very, very conservative, let deer do what they do,
Right.
and fill in the landscape. And then that was our goal for many, many decades till we got to the point in time where the population was growing at a pretty good rate. We had to shift our focus and our management objectives as that population got to higher levels.
Yeah. I'm sure at the time, you think about it can be a little bit counterintuitive to think about, man, we've got this population. We want to see these deer continue to grow and the numbers continue to grow. It can be a little bit counterintuitive to think like, okay, so we need to open a hunting season. Do you know, and I know that was a long time ago, but just kind of maybe explain a little bit to someone who may not know like how that even works, of you've got people now hunting and the incentive to go and hunt, and how that actually ultimately helps the population continue to grow.
Yeah, so recognizing the growth potential of the population, we and especially this, interestingly, from a Missouri standpoint, specific with antlerless harvest, we started allowing hunters on a limited basis to harvest antlerless deer early on in the process. And I think that helped our hunters to recognize early on that harvesting antlerless deer is okay.
Mm-hmm.
And there were some states that were more conservative with that. And then when they started to initiate that, it was more of a little bit more of a shock to their hunting community that was used to year after year after year of antlered buck harvest only.
Mm-hmm.
So, there was very little risk with a antlered buck only season, there's no risk to the growth potential of the population. And with a very limited antlerless harvest opportunity, you could say the same. So the idea was, let's provide some recreational opportunity. And in doing so, it gets folks more excited about the resource and conserving it. So it served that purpose too. Okay, here, we have a population. It's still small, but it's big enough to have a limited hunting opportunity. That's cool. This is great. Let's actually work to conserve the species so that we'll have some additional opportunities to hunt as well. So
Yeah.
I think the key was, even though we had those seasons early, they were very conservative, and then they became more liberal through time so that we didn't jeopardize the growth potential of the population.
Gotcha. Yeah, that makes sense. You get people excited about, hey, I can go out here and harvest a deer and bring some food home and meat back to the freezer, the table for my family. I want to now follow the program, follow the rules, so that this continue to grow and that we can liberalize these seasons and have more hunting opportunities.
Exactly.
That makes sense. So then that's in the 40s and 50s. It kind of sounds like you had mentioned the Ozarks were kind of serving as if that's where the original population, maybe the most of the 400 deer were. Did those refuges mostly exist within the Ozarks and then kind of translocated deer out of the Ozarks into the other parts of the state of Missouri?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
Okay.
The refuges were in the southern part of the state, and they were important to our whitetail recovery efforts, but also our wild turkey recovery efforts as well. So there was, not to get too far down the turkey road, but you guys know my background, so I can't help it sometimes. But those refuges were key to the recovery of both species, and they served as the place where those populations were allowed to be protected. The habitat was managed very carefully, and then those served as source stock for translocations to help spread the critters throughout the state.
Gotcha. I didn't know that. I feel like that's kind of a cool history of just the uniqueness of the Ozarks and the terrain and the features that we have here allowed it to kind of serve as a breeding ground, if you will, to then help replenish the rest of the state. So even within a single state like Missouri or like Arkansas, you've got the benefit of having a diverse area, diverse terrains within your state borders that you can use kind of to your benefit to help further your conservation goals and achieve a sustainable population. And just being able to use that terrain is something that I wasn't really aware of. That was part of the history.
I don't think I was either.
That's pretty cool.
I know we talked about it on the Arkansas side, but I don't think I even realized it was the Ozarks that was the reason. It was just we had some here.
Yeah.
We had some wildlife refuges here, and that makes sense. But no, I wouldn't have thought that it was because they were already there. They were more protected, harder to get to, and then just, I don't know, better area for them to to grow and then serve the rest of the state.
It makes sense though. Like you
Does.
think about the terrain, it would be tough to get back up in here and kill some deer that were left. So, moving forward in the 80s, 90s, moving up into the 2000s, when did things really start to accelerate? Because I know, at a certain point, you kind of hit this exponential curve of like this population is just continuing to grow. At what point did you start seeing things get to things have to get more sustainable? We've liberalized seasons. Maybe we need to be more conservative and get to more of a year-to-year baseline versus always going for more growth, maximizing growth.
Yes, I mean, we consider, if you look at the various phases of deer management Missouri, once you get into the 80s, we kind of call that the start of the stabilization phase, where deer numbers were starting to, and it varied some, certainly from, obviously there's a big diversity from southern to central to north Missouri. But as we got into the 80s, there was certain, more so in central and north Missouri, recognizing that populations were getting closer to where we wanted them to be, and we needed to shift our management focus to try to stabilize the population by increasing antlerless harvest. Not so much in the Ozarks, really. Deer numbers by design have been growing steadily, but not at a real rapid rate for many decades now. So the story of deer in Missouri Ozarks is very different from central and north. So as we got into, and I'll contrast the Ozarks with central and north just to give people some perspective.
Yeah.
Come back to the Ozarks, but like if we look at period of the late 90s, early 2000s, like there was a lot of central and north Missouri counties where we were actually over objective. We had too many deer.
Okay.
So at that point in time, we're becoming very liberal with antlerless harvest opportunities, trying to bring numbers down. And if you want, we can talk a little bit of how we even assess where the population is in regard to where we want it to be. But at that point in time, we're trying to bring numbers down in central and north Missouri, while at the same time allow the populations, the Ozarks, to continue to grow. And so if you look at the landscape in central and north Missouri, highly diverse, a lot of open land intermixed with forest. There's cropland, there's CRP, other grassland. It's just really prime. And a lot of the Ozarks, it's dominated mostly by forest.
Right.
It's rocky ground. There's not the supplemental food that there is in other parts of the state. And so the growth potential of the population is just less. They don't have, you just don't have the some might consider ideal deer habitat of central and north Missouri. So, at that time was kind of interesting because we're trying to reduce numbers in central and north, have essentially wide open seasons, many days of firearms hunting opportunity. A hunter, as I mentioned earlier, could fill unlimited numbers of firearms antlerless permits.
That's wild.
Wow.
At the same time, in most southern Missouri counties, you're limited to one firearms antlerless permit. And the antlerless portion of firearms deer season wasn't open in most South Missouri counties. So at that time, we had overabundance in the northern 2/3 of the state, and we're still growing the population in the southern part of the state. And we were pretty successful in north and central Missouri. Numbers were coming down by design through increased harvest. And then we hit 2012, we had the most severe hemorrhagic disease outbreak we've had. And that took its toll on deer numbers in many, many counties, but particularly a lot of them in central and north Missouri. And so we're at this interesting point now, jumping ahead a little bit, where that HD outbreak in 2012 caused rapid mortality. We lost a lot of deer. We have populations in central and northern Missouri that have now recovered from that HD outbreak at the same time that deer populations in the Ozarks have finally gotten to a level where we feel like they're about where we want them to be. So we're at this interesting point in time right now where in most of our counties, deer numbers, whether that's in the Ozarks or central Missouri, north Missouri, about where we want them to be. And in most counties, they continue to increase.
Gotcha.
And so we're really, for the first time, I would say, at a point where across the north-south gradient, where our populations throughout that span of geographic space are about where we want them
About
to
where
be.
you want them, hitting that stable rate.
So about
Interesting.
100 years later, from 400 deer in the state, you're saying things look pretty good.
Yeah, there certainly are plenty of challenges, but if
Sure.
you look simply at how many deer do we have on the landscape and about how many do we want,
Yeah.
we're to that point where, it used to be for many years the hunters in central and north Missouri were saying, we've got great deer numbers, hunting's great. And southern Missouri, boy, we'd like to have some more. And so we've maintained that conservative approach. But if you look at our 2024 fall deer and turkey booklet and you look at where the antlerless portions of firearms deer season are open and how many firearms antlerless permits a hunter can fill, there's really not very many counties in the Ozarks that look any different from Central and North Missouri County. They're pretty much liberal all across the state, with the exception of way up in the northwest corner of Missouri and in our eastern Ozarks and down in the Boot Heel.
Yeah.
Other than
Okay.
that, it's liberal in most places of the state.
Gotcha. That's a good point. What you were saying is to think about the amount of time it takes to get back to a place where we feel like is stable. I mean, this is a 100-year effort from the point in time that we had 400 in the whole state to now we feel like we're in a more stable position. And yeah, there's lots of challenges and other things that we have to talk about and face. But overall numbers, it's taken 100 years to get here. So if things get out of balance and out of whack and you start seeing things change and on a trajectory that is headed back towards any one way, positive, more or less, that can have an impact and an effect that could last a century, essentially. So it's important to kind of keep things in balance and making sure that we're monitoring and maintaining this stuff. Am I speaking correctly there, or am I don't mean to fearmonger, but just making the point that these impacts can last a long time.
Yeah, and I think we were in obviously a very unique situation 100 years ago compared to we are today. And I think in terms of the fluctuations that we see now, we monitor the population closely, and if we have a severe hemorrhagic disease outbreaks that causes a lot of deer mortality, we can adjust our harvest regulations. They're going to be down for a few years and then they'll bounce back. So it's not as if we expect to have stable deer numbers annually, but if we start to see the population head in a direction that we don't want it to go in, we can adjust harvest regulations and keep it on track.
Keep it back to where you want it to.
Certainly keep it within a reasonable range around that ideal level.
Gotcha. Yeah, I saw you looking at me when I was saying that. I was like, he's not jiving with me. I'm trying to make a point, and he's like, actually, we can manage that a lot closer than that.
Yeah, it's just, if you think about the factors that were like you think about the mid to late 1800s, early 1900s. That was a time like we'll never see that again.
Right.
So that magnitude of population decline, we're certainly not going to see again. But that doesn't mean that we won't get to a point where we'll have too few deer. 2012 was a good example. We went from having overabundant deer, and then after that 1 year, our hunters across a lot of the state were saying we don't have enough deer.
Right.
And the surveys were very evident, and the number of reports was staggering from that year. And so we said, all right, we're seeing that. We hear you. We're collecting information that supports that assertion. And so we're going to become more conservative. And so we did, and then numbers bounced right back.
What was, for that to just be kind of a one-time thing, what caused that to have such an impact in 2012 that hasn't continued on year after year after year?
Sure. Yeah, so that virus is transmitted by a biting midge, we might call a no-see-um, little biting midge that disease tends to be more severe when you have really bad drought. So if you have a moist spring and a really bad drought, it just creates ideal conditions for that virus. And so 2012 fit the bill perfectly for that. And so we had the ideal conditions for that virus. So we get some mortality from hemorrhagic disease every year, but if we typically have a moist spring followed up by a dry summer, it draws down the water, creates a lot of mud flats where those no-see-ums breed, and of course it's hot, drought, the deer come into water to drink, and so you have the vector and the deer at the same place. And it just creates the perfect storm. So
Gotcha.
That's why in most years you'll have a little bit of it, and then when the stars align, in this case in the wrong way, you can have a significant mortality event. But usually it's about once every decade or so that we see a severe outbreak. So it's not all that common.
I gotcha. That makes sense. And what was, if you had to kind of put a number on it, the overall impact? How bad was it that X amount of deer died? And I know you mentioned we went from overpopulated to underpopulated, but total numbers, was it 50% of the deer population was just wiped out from this in these places where it had the outbreak, or?
Not on a large scale. It wasn't that significant. It's hard to put a number on, what we would anticipate the mortality rate was, but to put it into perspective, on an average year, we'll get, 100 to 150 reports of suspect cases where somebody will find a dead deer by a pond, report it to us. That year we had over 10,000.
Oh,
So,
wow.
I mean, it was massive. And it wasn't just Missouri. There was many other states involved that were impacted as well. So it's hard to put a number on how many deer we lost out of our population. But that was the biggest, broadest impact we've seen, and most significant and broadest geographically. And so, to your point, where there's some localized areas that lost half their deer, I'm sure there were.
Mhm.
And the way that disease works, it tends to be kind of patchy. So you may have a landowner that found all sorts of dead deer. Then you go down the road a couple miles, and maybe somebody didn't find any. So it tends to be spotty, but it was of substantial magnitude.
Yeah. Wow.
Have y'all been in a drought this summer like we've been for the most part? I mean, Missouri Ozark's been pretty dry since mid-July.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's been dry, and if you look at the drought monitor now, southwest, extreme southwest Missouri, and then up the state border north is certainly in a drought. Most of the states certainly abnormally dry. It's been a weird year because we had a lot of moisture in the spring, and then as we got into summer, it was dry, and then 3 weeks ago or so, I think it was, where I live in central Missouri, we got 3 or 4 inches in like
Yeah.
a day, and then hasn't rained dropped since.
Yeah.
So it's
I just
You know,
didn't know
it's
if
just
this
been
was another
odd.
year that you're looking at that disease going.
Conditions
the
are kind of
conditions are looking
trending.
like that, or maybe not. I don't know.
No, and the last 3 summers actually have been dry, and more so last year and the year before. I was thinking going into the summer with the conditions, I was thinking, especially last year, like this may be the year, because it happens about every 10 years.
Yeah,
It
you
happened in
mentioned that.
2012. I'm thinking we may be in for another bad HD year, but it's been kind of spotty. There definitely have been some counties that have been impacted
Mhm.
the last couple of years, and this year we're getting a few reports, but nothing very significant.
Okay. Gotcha.
That's good to know.
Yeah, that is good to know. So you talking about overall health right now, it sounds like you're saying we've got about the right amount of deer that we want to have on the landscape, kind of throughout the whole state. As far as the overall health, and I know you guys look a lot at ratios and things like that, what is the current status and condition of the white-tailed deer population in the whole state, but specifically the Ozarks too?
Yeah, in terms of the overall health of the population, they're doing really well right now. The primary way that we determine, the desired level of deer is really through, obviously we want our deer population to be within biological carrying capacity, or the level that if you have so many deer, obviously they can cause impacts to forest regeneration, they can impact other species. So we think about biological carrying capacity as like the top, the ceiling, right?
Right.
But social carrying capacity, or the level of deer populations that our stakeholders, members of the public, will tolerate, is often well below the level that the landscape could sustain. And so we've always taken the approach that we do a lot of surveys. Each year we survey our deer hunters after the season, and we ask them all sorts of questions to get a wide range of information. But one of the questions we always ask is, in the county that you hunt most, do you think that there are too many, about right, or too few deer?
Mm-hmm.
And then we also send a survey to agricultural producers throughout the state, and we ask them the same question: on the land that you operate in, or that your farm is in, do you think there are too many, about right, or too few deer?
Interesting.
And with those 2 data sets, we can look at all 114 counties and say, okay, for example, Boone County, where I live, our hunters are saying this, our agricultural producers are saying this, and what we strive for is, obviously, you'll never have a situation where everybody's happy.
Mm-hmm.
But if you have a situation where there are more hunters that feel like deer numbers are about right than think that there are too few, and if you have more agricultural producers that feel like deer numbers are about right than too many,
Yeah.
you've kind of found that sweet spot between the desires of those 2 stakeholder groups that are often at the opposite ends of the spectrum in terms of what they think about deer
Yeah.
numbers.
Mm-hmm.
And so we use that as a barometer to where is that population in regard to how our stakeholders feel about deer numbers. And so when I say deer numbers are about right, throughout the vast majority of our state, we are at that point where if you look at the data from those 2 surveys, they suggest that we're kind of in that sweet spot.
Okay.
But populations are continuing to increase in most counties. So we're in this situation where, in a perfect world, we'd have stable populations in all 114 counties that were right at that level that I
Yeah.
just described, and we just keep it there forever. But that's not the real world, right? So we're at a situation where, numbers are at a level that's desirable for most of those two stakeholder groups, but they're continuing to increase. And so if you go back over the last, 8 years or so, roughly, and you look at our regulations throughout most of the state, they've been becoming more liberal through time. Whether you're down here in the Ozarks or in Central or North Missouri, after we had the HD outbreak that we talked about, we went from unlimited firearms antlers permits down to one in most counties. So from unlimited to one. We also shortened the antlerless portion, but then after that we gave that a few years, the population starting to increase, more and more deer. So then we started to gradually liberalize that antlerless harvest opportunity. So we're to a point now where it's kind of an interesting time because we've got deer numbers at desirable levels. We have, in most counties of the state, a lot of southern Missouri counties, a hunter can fill 4 firearms antlers permits, which is already more than most hunters shoot anyway.
Right.
So it's essentially, in effect, almost like having unlimited, because most hunters are satisfied with the deer. Certainly most are satisfied with 2. And even when we had
What is
unlimited,
that number for you guys? Because Ralph was saying it's like 1.1 down in Arkansas. The average hunter shoots 1 deer.
it's
about the same.
They're all about in the ballpark.
Okay.
Most hunters, if you look at the statistic for the percentage of hunters that shoot a deer, it's actually most hunters do not shoot a deer. We're in the mid 40s, so percent of hunters shoot a deer, and far fewer shoot 2, 3, 4. So, we're at a point in time where our permits are liberal enough in most counties that we're providing more permits than most people want to fill.
Yeah.
With regard to antlerless deer. And if you look at the length of our firearms deer season, we've got 7 different portions. We've got 2 separate antlerless portions. So, we've got this population that's increasing, but permits are very, very liberal. Seasons are very, very liberal. And in some counties, the deer numbers continue to increase despite all of this opportunity, which, presents us with this challenge of, okay, these are the tools that we've used in the past when we've had deer numbers that were, increasing, that we wanted to stabilize or in some cases decrease.
Mm-hmm.
Yet we're very liberal in both regards in terms of permits and days. And in some counties, hunters aren't shooting enough antlerless deer. So what's the next step?
You feel like you've maximized the opportunity, you've maximized the regulation to be able to harvest enough deer, but it's still not hitting that point that you need harvest to happen. And so you're like, all right, well, where do we go from here?
In a lot of counties, now, if you look at the eastern Ozarks, I would say that's not the case. In the eastern Ozarks, we're the most, there are other areas of the state too, but the eastern Ozarks are among our most conservative regulations. So the limit on firearms antlerless permits in those counties is 1 compared to 4 in most counties. And we also do not open the firearms antlerless portions in those counties. So they've got fewer firearms antlerless permits to use, and they cannot hunt during those 2 portions. So I would say we've certainly got a lot more wiggle room in the eastern Ozark counties where deer densities are lower. But in terms of like kind of the western fringe of the Ozarks, and certainly western Missouri, central and north, we're very, very liberal.
Yeah, interesting.
And what is all that data telling you, other than not enough people are hunting?
Well,
and if that might be all it is, then we can talk about that too. But I didn't know if not enough people are hunting. We need people to hunt.
I think it's a combination of things. We certainly have fewer hunters than we did at our peak. Our peak year, we were at about 517,000 deer hunters, and now we're about 480.
Okay.
So we're down quite a few hunters in general. And if we look at the demographics of our hunting population, we definitely have an older hunting population than we did years ago. And then we know that as people get older, they shoot fewer deer than they did when they were younger. So you have that factor. You also have a shift in hunter preferences through time, where we're seeing the rise of quality deer management, which a part of that is passing younger deer and trying to increase the age structure of the buck segment. Another important part of that, which a lot of hunters tend to forget about, is adequate antlerless harvest to keep the population at desired levels. So we're seeing through time this desire from an increased percentage of our hunters to pass on young bucks and harvest only mature bucks, and not as much interest in harvesting antlerless deer. And so that's obviously the way that we manage our deer herd, is through antlerless harvest, non-antlered buck harvest. And so that becomes a challenge when you see that you have fewer hunters, older hunters that shoot less deer on average, and then changing hunter preferences and just less of a desire to harvest antlerless deer. And so you add all those together, and it presents some challenges for deer managers.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you see, and I don't know what all data you guys have, but do you see within like the age ranges of, you mentioned we have older hunters, do you see like the 10 to 20, 20 to 30-year-olds adopting deer hunting at any different rate than previous, generations or age ranges? Basically thinking like, if once our older population, over time people pass on, will that be replaced at some point? Are we seeing that in the trends, or is it looking like it's just going to continue to go down?
Well, interestingly, the last couple years have the trend has changed a little bit, which I find interesting and surprising in a good way. Because if you look at our peak year, which was about 10 years ago, you look at the total number of deer hunters, we hit our peak, it started to decline, and then the rate of decline started to increase dramatically.
Mm-hmm.
And then all of a sudden, the last few years it stabilized, and then last year actually went up a little bit. And I'm not sure we've got a real firm understanding of why that happened.
Mm-hmm.
I think all indications would be that the declining trend will continue into the future.
Right.
But interestingly, the last couple of years, the trend has certainly changed. But I think if you look at the projections long term, population becoming more centered in urban versus rural areas, in a lot of cases in the last few years, it suggests otherwise, but not being able to recruit enough hunters compared to the number that we're losing. I think that'll continue to be a huge challenge, that not only here in Missouri, but throughout the country.
Yeah,
as
everywhere.
state agencies. And, there are species of wildlife that really don't need to be hunted for population management, but deer are certainly not one of those.
Yeah.
And so you think about the importance in Missouri. Last year we shot 326,000 deer in a year, that 1 year alone. You think about, okay, if we manage our deer population through hunter harvest to keep it at that socially acceptable levels, and we've had fewer people out there, and we're seeing some of these changes, the big question that we're facing is, what does the future of deer management look like, and how do we, because there's obviously a host of issues that happen if you have deer populations that are above ideal levels in terms of deer vehicle collisions, damaged agricultural crops, landscaping, other personal property. So you have those whole host of issues. But then if you think about ecological impacts, forest regeneration, which
Mhm.
impacts habitat further.
Mhm.
So that's one of the, and then again, it's not so much Ozarks, mostly, central and north Missouri, the more agricultural regions, but you're starting to hear more, particularly Midwestern biologists starting to wrestle with these challenges and trying to think about, okay, what does the future of deer management look like if these hunter declines continue?
Yeah, gotcha. I'm just curious, you're talking about the 10-year plan, something you guys have been working out on over the last year or so, and now going to be publishing something here pretty soon. How do you even begin to formulate a 10-year plan, looking out that far in advance, not knowing necessarily what's going to happen and the anomalies that occur, but just going off of recent history and recent trends? What all goes into that process?
Sure. Yeah, the first thing you do is, it's familiar with you anyway, but take a hard look at the old plan and recognize, okay, there's certainly going to be some similarities that haven't changed all that much in the last 10 years, but there's certainly going to be some things that have. So looking at the mission statement of the deer program, looking at the goals from the previous plan and the objectives and strategies, what have we accomplished from the old plan? What can we check off the list? And then what if we didn't get some things done, if they're still relevant, let's keep them on the list. And then what are the new challenges that we face that either weren't there to the same magnitude when the last 10-year plan was written? So that's really the foundation, is let's look at the old plan. What do we need to keep? What can we get rid of? And then what are these new challenges? And are they rise to the level that they become a brand new goal, or are they objectives nested within a goal, or are they strategies or tasks that are nested within an objective? So that's really the first part of the process.
Okay.
And so we did that internally. We have MDC has a whitetail deer working group that consists of a number of members from different branches within the agency. And so that was really the first step, is let's look at the old plan. Let's talk about the landscape that we're faced with now. What are the challenges that we face? And then how do we take those and incorporate those into the plan and address those?
Yeah. What were some of those things within those buckets of, like, all right, things that we achieve, we can get rid of, things that we need to work on that maybe we didn't achieve, but we need to keep on here, and then new things. Maybe just a few examples from each.
Yeah. So, I mean, if you think about harvest management, we certainly have made some notable strides in just the way that we have allocated hunting opportunity over that time period. If you think when the first plan was written, or the last plan was written, I should say, it was right after the HD outbreak in 2012. Deer numbers were lower. Um, the season, the structure of the seasons, the bag limits were altered because of that, and they've morphed and changed through time. Certainly, our education, the branch that we have now, we have a relevancy branch. We didn't have those prior to the last reorganization, but we have plenty of staff that are working on hunter recruitment efforts and trying to recognize, okay, the trends that we're heading in are not in a positive direction. Let's work on recruiting more hunters and getting more folks interested. In regard to CWD, when our last plan was written, we detected CWD just 2 years prior to the development of that plan, and so very different state from where we are now.
Right.
So that plan really helped us to get our management approach to CWD and how that approach has shifted and changed through time in response to the changing distribution and dynamics of the disease. So I think as we look to if you look at the plan, a lot of the goals are pretty similar, right? One is deer population management. We've got to manage the deer population. Another goal would be hunting and recreation, providing opportunity for stakeholders to enjoy the resource, whether it's consumptive or non-consumptive. Another goal would be deer health and disease, public engagement, communication. I mean, those are going to be the foundation of probably any deer plan for the foreseeable future.
Right.
But a lot of what we've changed in the new plan is recognizing what those challenges are. Big ones being chronic wasting disease, the hunter declines, changing hunter preferences, the changing way that people digest information in terms of how we communicate with the public. So those are some of the more substantial changes that have occurred since the last plan was written. And so it was really looking at that landscape and saying, where do these challenges, how do we best integrate them into the plan so that we can start to take what this plan is really a strategic plan. It's a high level. This is the framework within which we're going to manage our deer population, that will take that strategic plan and then step that down into an operational plan, which translates into the work plan items, right? The specific research projects, the specific other tasks and strategies that we're actually going to put on the ground. But I'd say, as we look at the future deer management, the big challenges would be chronic wasting disease, declines in hunter numbers, changing hunter preferences. Those would be, I mean, there are a number, but those would be some of the three that, in my mind, kind of rise to the forefront in terms of the big challenges that we need to tackle.
Gotcha.
I have a question on the communication side of things. What are y'all recognizing in the state in general, but even the younger population of people who are learning to digest state agency data and law and all of that kind of stuff? Like, you're 14, 15, picking up a reg book, reading through it and trying to make sense of it. And you're also spending a ton of time on the internet and on social media and all that kind of stuff. Like, how are y'all even thinking about trying to manage some of that communication style? Because that's interesting. I haven't heard somebody yet say, like, that's a problem and we don't know how to do that. Like, what are some of your thoughts within that?
Yeah, I mean, I certainly, for most of that, defer to the folks in our communications branch,
Sure.
whose specialty that is. They know much more about it than I do. But definitely, to your point, the way people consume and digest information now, not just younger folks, but even adults, is vastly different.
Yeah.
And so I think
it's so available now. It's like you can get information
at your fingertips
anywhere at any time.
So do we? How many folks go to the MDC office and grab the deer regulations booklet and bring it home and sit there and flip it page by page versus scrolling through the PDF or getting it from a news release or social media? It's definitely changed. And so we look to the folks in the communication branch. We work very closely to say, like, from my standpoint, I've got the information that we need to get out there. You guys tell me how I need to, because from a scientist standpoint, like, I'm used to the structure of peer-reviewed journals where you have this lengthy introduction to set the stage. You talk about your methods, you give the results, the discussion, implications.
Yeah.
And, your communication is this long, drawn-out process that's very thorough. If you read it start to finish, you understand it well.
Yeah.
But if nobody wants to read that, then they're going to miss it. So how do we take something that can be pretty complex and put it in abbreviated format to hit the highlights? And so it seems like we're doing a lot of things we're certainly on social media a lot, our website. and just trying to look at the trends and say, how are people consuming their information, and how do we take what we used to do that maybe was a longer format and put it in more bite-sized short pieces, and then refer them right at the bottom for more information. See here,
Go
and
here.
refer them.
Yeah.
So that it's just a changing style of consumption of these, and trying to keep for our communication folks, trying to keep up with what are the preferred ways of getting the information, and how do we make sure that we don't have this desire of our stakeholders to get information through this one way, but we're still stuck years back communicating in a way that's outdated, that they don't want, or aren't interested in.
Yeah, you don't want the scientist who has all the information. You don't also probably want him leading the social media.
No, you
team.
don't. No, you don't.
Because like you think about, when you're scrolling through your social media, a post comes on screen, you usually decide probably within the first 1, 2, 3 seconds whether you're going to like actually interact with that.
It's quick.
And so you can't give the peer review process and the history and the context and all that stuff. You have to like give them something, but give it to them in a way where it's not out of context, and it can be digestible, and then you give them the opportunity to go deeper if they want to. Yeah. That's a tough challenge, because thinking about like, okay, yeah, we're having a conversation right now that's going to last an hour 15. And if someone consumes all this, they'll have some more awareness. But to try to give someone everything that they need in the first 3, 5, 10 seconds, you're just never going to be able to do that. So it's a complex issue to try to get that information out there.
Especially with regard to regs, right? Because they are what they are, and the rules are the rules. And our dear booklet it's got a few pages in it.
Yeah.
And so, how do you? And so we've done things like, an example. It's not, social media or digital, but like an example would be on the back of our regulations booklet. What's new for 2024?
Yeah.
Bulleted list.
There you go.
Not that that's an excuse not to be familiar with the regs throughout the whole booklet, but it's a way for folks to quickly digest something.
It's a highlight for sure.
And we've tried with our news releases, just hit the highlights, get the key information, refer folks to the website or the booklet for additional information. So that's just, and thankfully we've got a robust communications branch with some great folks working in it that keep up to date on all of that stuff.
Yeah.
It allows me to do what I need to do, and I can give them the information. They can tell me how best to convey it.
Absolutely. What about the hunter numbers? You mentioned declining hunter numbers. That's always something that I'm curious. Like you mentioned this. It's not just a Missouri issue. This is across the board. We're seeing this on a widespread scale in the U.S. You have a declining number of people hunting, and the people who are still hunting typically shoot like 1, maybe 2 deer. It's like less deer than what people probably used to shoot. So you have this like conflating data pointing down. Like everything, all arrows point down to like declining hunters, declining harvest. What do you do about that? How do you even begin to approach that on a state level to look at what can we do to combat this?
Yeah, and I'll say too, another plug for our staff. We've got a great relevancy and education branch that's part of what they do, and certainly have dedicated folks that is part of the significant part of their job is try to figure out what we can do. I think just some of the shifts that we've seen through time, some have focused exclusively on recruiting youths, and I think that's a great thing. But I think you've seen some agencies through time that have recognized we probably have a large segment, or at least a decent percentage of our adults that don't hunt, that if given the right opportunities and made aware of the opportunities, might like to try it, right? There's the locavore movement, some folks wanting to know exactly where their food comes from that didn't grow up in hunting families, but if you ask them in a survey, would you hunt if you had somebody that could mentor you? There's a decent percentage that would probably do it. And so I think through time we've seen a shift from still emphasizing the importance of recruiting young hunters, but recognizing, boy, there's probably a lot of adults that didn't grow up in hunting families that at least maybe they garden, or maybe they fish, they hike, they spend a lot of time outdoors that given the right opportunities. So it seems like that's been kind of an untapped resource that trying to attract more folks doing that.
I feel like that's a big opportunity, because like you mentioned, I see that a lot on social media, and people that I see and talk with, people care more about where their food comes from today. They want a more local, more organic option, and there's nothing more local or organic than a wild like venison that you shot off of your property or some public land near you, that you know what it's been eating, you know where it's been, you know how it died, it wasn't sick, like all of these things. I feel like that's a huge opportunity for people to be like, man, this is a really, really accessible, high quality, high protein resource that I can go out and get it, for depending on where you're at, like in Arkansas, we've got archery season almost 5-6 months out of the year. So it's like a very available thing.
It is, and the challenging part is, if you grow up hunting, sometimes it's easy to take for granted, like all the knowledge you've gathered from start to finish. What caliber rifle should I shoot, and where do I aim when I shoot a deer? What do I do if I get one? How do I field dress it? How do I cook it? What are the regulations? And so, I think a lot of it is breaking. First, you got to make the connection so that person has the opportunity, but then trying to break down as much of the barriers for that person, because I think for a lot of them, and understandably so, it's like intimidating.
Yeah.
You take somebody that's never deer hunted and you hand them the deer and turkey booklet and you say, okay, digest all of this, and then that'll give you the regulations. That doesn't provide really information on what kind of gear you should use or where you should go. I mean, there's a lot that I think hunters that have done it for a while just take for granted in terms of whether it be the knowledge they've accrued or access. That's a whole nother issue. Where do you go, even if you have the interest and if you have the equipment and you have somebody to take you? So there's a lot of challenges, but we've got folks that are actively working on that to try to break down those barriers as much as we can, understand as much as we can about that segment of whether it be youth or the adults that have that interest. What are the demographics of those folks? What are some of the barriers that we can potentially try to break down to get them involved? Because if we can't do that long term, it's going to be really difficult to achieve our deer management goals if we do not recruit more people to hunt.
Yeah, absolutely. What were some of the other facets of the plan that you mentioned that you feel like are a big focus that we should talk about?
Yeah, certainly CWD management. We first detected the disease in our wild herd in 2012. Since then, we've certainly seen an expansion of the disease geographically. We're up to 39 positive counties. We've had over 500 positives since 2012. So in terms of the status of the disease, it certainly changed a lot from 2014 when we wrote our last plan. And so that presents, obviously, clearly some management challenges. Thankfully, even though we have it in a number of counties, the percentage of the population that's infected continues to be really low. So we have in Missouri, a very robust, aggressive surveillance program. Last year, we tested, for example, over 37,000 deer in a single year. I mean, tremendous number of deer. So we've got a good handle, on where the disease is located in our state. We've got a really aggressive management program too. We've got a broad suite of regulations that go in place within our management zone. We do localized management, both within the season in terms of issuing CWD management permits to landowners close to where positives have been detected, to our targeted removal efforts that occur outside of the hunting season to try to remove additional positives, lower deer densities in those localized areas, and slow the spread. But certainly a big challenge is for us is, you think back to when the last plan was written in 2014, we'd only detected the disease in a handful of counties. And in terms of localized management, we could put all our resources into the few spots we had it.
Right.
And now you fast forward to 2024 and you have, the disease in a number of different places. We have a finite, staffing resource. And so what does management look like now that we cannot devote all of our efforts into one or two or three different places? How do we adapt? How do we adapt our management approach? Are there new strategies that we can use? And that's establishing our plan now and realizing that 10 years from now, or even 5 years or 2 or 3, things are going to have to change. And one of you brought up a point earlier in terms of adapting. And so I think that's one thing that we try to convey with our plan too, is the 10-year plan is a long window.
Yeah.
And there are some things that are going to be pretty shelf stable for 10 years and there's others that are not. Mm-hmm. And so making sure that we've defined this framework within which to work, but recognizing that there's going to have to be we have to be fluid and adaptive as we move forward. So, but I'd say going back to your question, just how we, approach management of CWD is going to be clearly one of the big challenges within the next 10 years for our agency.
Yeah. So you mentioned last year, MDC tested 37,000.
Yeah. over 37,000.
And how many of those came back positive?
It was less than 200.
Less than 200.
So we had, if you looked at the percentage of the overall samples that were tested, it was less than 0.5%.
Okay.
And so certainly a good thing. If you look at within our CWD core areas, which are areas within are about 2 miles or so of where we detected a positive last year, even the percentage that tested positive in that localized area was only about 1%.
Okay.
So, we're dealing with a disease that hasn't been on the landscape very long. And I think in terms of the call them apparent prevalence rates, but it just simply means what number of samples tested positive divided by the total number of samples. So that apparent prevalence or percentage of the population that's infected continues to remain low. And I think that's a testament to our aggressive management actions, the support of landowners and hunters to try to manage the disease and keep the infection rates or the apparent prevalence rates as low as we possibly can for as long as we possibly can. And so that'll be a challenge for us, is how do we shift those management efforts where we need to be able to protect our deer herd from this disease. It's a huge, significant challenge.
Yeah.
As the dynamics of the disease and the distribution changes moving forward.
Interesting. So at a 0.5% is what you were saying of the total deer tested. It's such a low percentage. It's interesting how much coverage and how much everyone talks about CWD is that just a result of the trend that has changed since 2012 of going from I'm assuming way less than 0.5% even, and now to get to the point where we're at 0.5%. Is that why it gets so much focus, because we're seeing a trend going up, or is it just because you see what I'm trying to ask? Is like, it seems so small, but it is a real problem. So what is the focus? Like, why do we focus on it so much?
So it's a good question. It's one I get all the time.
Yeah.
And I think the conversation, the answer to that question depends to some degree if you're in Missouri or elsewhere. So in Missouri, the infection rates, even where we've had the disease the longest, are still in the low single digits. But there are other places, other states and Canadian provinces where more than half the hunter-harvested deer test positive.
Oh, wow.
And we're starting to see in some of the western states that have had CWD for a long time, starting to see some significant population declines in deer and elk populations that are attributed, at least in part, to CWD. So the infection rates in those herds are getting to a point where it's causing population decline. And it's not like hemorrhagic disease where it hits the population and you let it go 2-3 years and it rebounds right back. Like there are no indications that it's this temporary rebound and it'll bounce back. It's like this precipitous decline that's extremely concerning. So if you think about, you contrast Missouri's situation where, less than 1 in 100 deer test positive versus other areas where more than half of the deer that get harvested test positive. There's obviously a huge disparity in those two.
Right.
And so I'll get the question a lot. Okay, we hear about CWD management and the importance of CWD management in Missouri, but less than 1 in 100 are testing positive. Why are we making such a big deal out of it? It's because we know from trends in other states that once the percentage that get infected, get even 3, 4, 5%, then just a few years later, you're at 10, 15, 20. It's like exponential growth, right?
Yeah.
Once you hit that inflection point in the graph, before you know it, you're there are some states where it's gone from low single digits to over 50% of the hunter-harvested adult bucks testing positive within a couple decades.
Yeah, wow.
And it seems to be that the area that you have to manage the disease and slow the spread is when it's really early, before you hit that inflection point.
Yeah.
And so I'll have hunters say sometimes, boy, it would seem like, we should manage the disease when it's to the point where it's worse, right? If it becomes more of a problem, then let's do something about it. And so I just stress the importance of, there's really, once you hit that inflection point and the infection rate takes off, at that point in time, there's very little that can be done. The time to act is early. And so we're in this window where, our apparent prevalence rates are really low. We haven't hit that inflection point. So if we can maintain aggressive, we can keep those rates really low. If we don't do anything and just take the foot off the gas a little bit and hit that point, they're going to accelerate.
Gotcha.
Yeah, by doing the work now, you're keeping it from ever getting to that point, hopefully.
Yes, and that presents, we talked about communication earlier, that presents a huge communication challenge, because it's easy to perceive that there really isn't that much of a problem when it's low. People aren't seeing sick deer that are dying from CWD. They're not seeing deer on their trail cameras that don't look healthy, so you can be lulled into a false sense of security that it's not really something to worry about. but we know that that's not the case. And as we just mentioned, the time, we have to keep stressing the time to act is early, because if you wait a little bit longer, it's too late.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't think I really fully grasped that, because I was with you. I'm hearing you say those numbers. I'm like, man, that's so small. Like, but I hear about this all the time. It's like, why is this such a big focus? But it makes sense. And to be able to have the information and the data from other states and other areas where it is more prevalent, and they've seen a decline happen over time, and now the prevalence that they show, seeing what got them to that point makes you want to make different actions, because we know about it and because there's things that we can do. But it does sound like you mentioned keep it as low as possible as we can for as long as possible. It does sound like there will come a point where, like, there's not been really any findings that we can actually stop this at this point. Like, is that correct in saying that? It feels like this will continue to grow and spread.
So there are examples where if you catch an infection really early and remove deer, there's of course a chance that you've removed the positive deer before they've had a chance to spread, and you can, and there's evidence where this has occurred. Like if you have a really localized outbreak, it could just disappear. If you've removed the positive individuals before they've spread the infectious agent in the environment to other deer, then that's the ultimate hope. In Missouri, I mean, the disease is here to stay. Of course, we recognize that. But I think in terms of management, it becomes adapting to try to figure out what's the best thing we can do with the resources that we have given the circumstances. And I think we've certainly slowed the spread, and we'll continue to aggressively manage the disease to do that. It just changes through time. When your resources get more thinly spread,
Right.
you have more areas of infection, same number of staff. How do you adapt? So I think long term, our goals are just going to be, how do we do the best we can working with hunters and landowners to keep those infection rates low so they don't hit that inflection point.
Yeah.
And like you're not going to be able to sustain the same type of effort in all areas through time.
Yeah.
So there are, we'll come to some situations, and we have already, where you have, let's say you have an area of infection here that for whatever reason, access issues, location, infection rates, maybe we just can't do localized management there anymore. We'd like to be able to, but we have these other areas here where we feel like access is better. We can remove more deer. We can slow the spread more. So as unfortunate it is, just having to make those hard decisions of we can't be everywhere. So where can we be most effective? And we're going to have to just recognize that there are going to be some areas where, we just can't work with the same intensity, or maybe we don't, do localized management anymore.
Yeah. Interesting. Yeah, that's a big challenge. You got your work cut out for you. We all do, and I think that's something too that we try to talk about from time to time. Is yes, we all look to our conservation agencies as the leader and taking the lead on this, but it's not just your job. It's all of our job to get out there and participate in the program. Get out there and hunt. Take the deer. Take more than one deer if that's what we need to do, and that's what the regulations are saying, is to take your fair share of deer and harvest your tags. It kind of comes back on everybody. That's the responsibility that we all share as conservationists and hunters. It's not just Jason's job, as much as it probably feels like you get a bunch of heat and pressure on your shoulders sometimes. We all take part in this, and it's all, up to us to participate.
Yeah, I mean, exactly. I mean, you think about the regulations that we have on the books, the CWD testing, localized management. Hunters and landowners are a huge partner in all those efforts, and if hunters are knowledgeable about the disease, if they're digesting the information on our website, if they're following the regulations designed to slow the spread, if they're having the deer tested in areas where it's required, if they're participating in localized management, either during the season through use of the CW management permits, or after the season through target removal, absolutely they're a key partner. And, it was interesting. We did a survey this past summer of our deer hunters, and, some of the questions we asked it was really encouraging to read the results. We asked some questions, that we asked the deer hunters on the survey. Do you think that hunters, can help to slow the spread of CWD in Missouri? And do you think they have a responsibility to do so? And most of the hunters that responded to that survey said, yes, we feel like we can help slow the spread. And we feel like an even higher percentage said it is our responsibility. So when you see results of the survey like that, it's just really encouraging that our hunters are recognizing that it's not just MDC in this fight, that we're part of it too, and we need to do everything we can.
Yeah. Well, we appreciate you for spending some time with us and coming on the podcast. And to our listeners, if you guys enjoyed this episode, send it to a buddy. Send it to somebody in Missouri who maybe needs to hear some of this information, who didn't know about the deer program and what's all going on. We appreciate y'all for listening, and we hope to see you on the next one.